College football nerds here talking Alabama and Florida State. Josh, they're probably saying the spread on this is double digits. Why are they covering this game? Well, week 2 is not so great, and we want to celebrate every big out of conference game we can for week 1. So this one is one we're going to talk about. Josh, this is interesting to me. One, because Florida State had a down year the last year, but they were actually really good the year before. This is a name brand on the schedule. Alabama plays 2 Power 4 teams out of conference, as does Florida State. And they should both be celebrated for that. So there's been a lot of talk from a certain Florida State quarterback in the offseason that Alabama has no longer Nick Saban to save them, and that a big old butt whooping is coming. That's paraphrasing, of course. Vegas doesn't necessarily agree, but the line is a little bit closer than maybe you or I would have picked if we're picking this game. We'll find out later because we both kind of put our names on some scores. Josh, if you were guessing, what do you think is contributing to that maybe a little more uncomfortable Vegas spread than Alabama fans would want to see?
Well, the narrative I've been hearing in this game, a lot of it has centered to do with the fact that it's Gus Malzahn, who gave Alabama fits for years, and a mobile quarterback. And when you look last year what Alabama succeeded and struggled with, the 2 games where they obviously had the most issues were Vanderbilt and Oklahoma. In those games, Alabama gave up 257 yards rushing to Oklahoma. I think that if that wasn't a season high, it was very close to it. And they gave up 166 yards to Vanderbilt on the ground. Both those teams were running quarterbacks. Neither one of those teams is very good at throwing the football. Heck, Oklahoma threw for under 100 yards in that game versus Alabama. And so the thought is with Gus Malzahn and that scheme where they can leverage a running quarterback, and they've got a great athlete in Castellanos, that they're going to be able to give Alabama fits. Now, we'll get into that a little bit. I think maybe there's some wrinkles to that discussion. But if you were to ask me, take that combined with a new quarterback at Alabama and the way Alabama ended the season playing at times pretty bad football, frankly, especially on the offensive side of the ball, I think that's why that point spread is, I mean, still high. I think 12.5 now to 13.5, but not a dominant high for Alabama playing a team that was 2-10 last year. I mean, you don't expect that game to be a 2 touchdown point spread.
So, we just got finished talking about Texas and Ohio State. And in that discussion, towards that end of the discussion, also, it's a really good preview. Also, Alabama fans, we did a season preview. If you want to check that out, just kind of a plug for that. But one of the things that you talked about, which is a totally fair point, is that a lot of the top teams are rebuilding, reloading because they lost a ton from their team last year in the draft. And especially at quarterback, there's a lot of turnover, including Alabama at that spot. But Alabama is one of those teams that's actually not reeling from a huge loss of 12, 14 players in the draft. They're of all names, a name that's coming back, Alabama, with a lot of returning talent. It's interesting to me that this team seems to be flying a little under the radar. I know Pate picked them to win the national championship, but the discussion is not around how much they're returning. Is that interesting to you at all?
It is, honestly. So, I mean, there have only been 9 teams in college football history that had 12 or more players drafted. Of those 9 teams, 3 of the 9 were last year. Kind of crazy, right? I mean, we talk about that in the Ohio State Texas preview. Certainly, it's the most number of players drafted from 2 teams playing in week 1 ever. There's no doubt about that. But I also think it's probably the only time there's been 2 teams with over 10 players drafted in the same game. And you can get in the comments if I'm wrong, but I don't think it's ever happened. And so when you look around the landscape of college football, depending on how you want to rank it, something like 9 out of the top 10 teams are replacing the quarterback. It's a huge turnover year. But, Alabama, who has still recruited at an extremely high level, did not have a huge draft. I mean, they had 7 guys drafted. They had 2 first-rounders in Booker and Campbell. Milroe goes in the 3rd round. And then other than that, Tim Smith is in the 6th, Malachi Moore in the 4th, Q Robinson in the 4th, Robbie Utes in the 5th. That's not a typical Alabama draft. And I think, I don't have this in front of me, but I think I looked it up, and it was something like second fewest in the last 10 years for Alabama, something like that. I think there's one other draft where they tied that number. And so it is interesting because you have an Alabama team that returns a ton of guys on the defensive side of the ball. Really, I mean, one defensive lineman, an edge rusher that was the starter but didn't play for half the season. Otherwise, defensively, pretty much intact. They had a ton of freshmen that got experience, were playing really good football. Even in the loss to Michigan, they were a great defensive team. And on the offensive side of the ball, ton of returning starters all around, receiver, running back room. They have a transfer out, but and of course Jam Miller is going to be hurt in this game, but still a ton of players with quality and depth. They've had some shakeups to the offensive line, but really kind of despite the fact that they're returning a ton of starters, just guys that have either maybe lost their starting role. Right tackle transfers to Nebraska because he may or may not have started. It is interesting. And I said in the preview, I thought Alabama's probably being slept on a little bit because this team was one of the top 10 teams in quality metrics in our models last year, and they seem like the team most likely to improve almost to the whole list. So I do think it's interesting. And I do think it's interesting in particular, again, because this is playing a 2-10 Florida State team. I mean, they're still a big favorite, but not a colossal favorite. I mean, Vegas still has this line at a point to say this could be a potentially competitive game, if not an upset, with a less than 2 touchdown point spread.
So I think that Florida State is going to bounce back from that 2-10 year last year. I don't think they're going to be the undefeated regular season team that they were the year before, but probably somewhere in between. And Vegas is probably baking that in a little bit. And you've got a first-time starter going on the road in a hostile environment in Doak. So I think that's playing into it a little bit. Josh, let's talk a little bit about the fact that Alabama fans, a lot of them have agreed with us over the years, but a lot of them have also gotten upset with us, disagree with us in our criticisms of Jalen Milroe going out. We've got some more data of him in the preseason, and look, preseason is weird. Sometimes you're with the starters, sometimes you're against the starters, and you don't have your own starters. It's weird like that. But it is interesting that Jalen Milroe in the NFL preseason is the same guy that he has been. And to me, a lot of that points to really a lot of justified optimism at the quarterback position for Alabama in a weird way.
Yeah, the thing that really stuck out about Alabama down the stretch last year offensively, I think more than anything else, was turnovers. I mean, they had 3 turnovers, 3 interceptions the Oklahoma game, interception the Auburn game, interception the Michigan game, probably as many or more fumbles. The fumble problem, last preseason game showed up again with Jalen Milroe watching those. I mean, twice? I know the highlights, he fumbled on a quarterback sneak. Not a good thing when they're looking at him to be a gadget run player. I think they're probably evaluating him right now. For those that don't know how the NFL operates, you usually can only have 2 quarterbacks active. The third guy, they have the ability to tab a third quarterback that plays if the first 2 are injured. And I think they were trying to experiment with having Milroe be the number 2 quarterback so he could play 5 or 6 snaps a game as a running guy in the red zone for the Seahawks. And then, if that doesn't, if he were to actually go down hurt, or if Darnold was going down hurt after his $100 million acquisition, Drew Lock would actually come in and be the starter of the next game. But the idea would be that you'd try to pair Darnold with Milroe to avoid Darnold getting hurt. The one thing they don't want to see is Milroe fumble. But that was a thing that, I think we even talked about was kind of way under the radar with him, is when they had a negative play, when the offensive line broke down, when there was a rusher, he was going to hit Milroe, and the rate fumble rate that Milroe had on sacks was astronomical. And so, yeah, I mean, I think he is kind of the same guy. He's always going to be a lightning rod for a variety of reasons. If for no other reason than he can make some of the most spectacular plays you've ever seen, and he can make some of the worst plays you've ever seen. His negative play rate was extremely high, but paired with a guy that is as talented, maybe the most talented Alabama quarterback in years, in my opinion, he just doesn't have it all together. I don't know if he will or won't, but he is a lightning rod. I think what you get with Simpson, though, in this transition, look, on tape, and Alabama fans got mad at this, was a lot of them wanted to bench Milroe last year. We went back and watched some of the tape he had from a little bit of the Wisconsin game, Mercer game, and FCS team. He did not look comfortable. And he's running around and trying to make a play or leaving a clean pocket, even against Mercer, where he should have stood there, and he had forever to play. Now, when he threw the ball, he was more accurate. He could be decisive. He's got a good arm. He's a very underrated athlete himself. But I saw a guy that didn't have great pocket presence, probably worse than Milroe on tape. Maybe that's changed. Seems like they feel like he's taken a huge step forward. They've talked a lot about in their camp that they had something like 4 turnovers or 4 interceptions the entire fall camp. So obviously he had huge steps forward there. But there's reasons to have some sort of caution, when it comes to Alabama in week 1. The thing I'll say, though, is ball placement and consistency. Alabama can do things from a scheme perspective they couldn't do before. Ryan Grubb, in an interview recently, talked about how Alabama had to run sort of a Jalen Milroe offense because of who he was, and they're going to be different things this year. When I watched Jalen Milroe's highlight tape, because somebody asked about this, in the entire, it was a 6-minute highlight tape, I saw 1 RPO. 1. The entire tape. They were not running RPOs. They were running set called plays. Yes, there might have been a run or a pass option to the play, but it was audible from the sideline. He was not reading defenses throwing RPO. I think the reason for that, the Oklahoma game, they tried to do RPOs at the start of the second half. One of the turnovers was an RPO red screen pass that got intercepted. And just all around, I don't think he was ever comfortable with it. I've even heard from people around the program, because we both know some people down there in the Southeast. The Saban staff in 2023 took away almost all the RPO packages. I think you're going to see that more with Simpson. Wide receiver screens are a very big part of the offense. It's what they like to do at Washington, DeBoer, Grubb both. They love those plays. It's a way to spread the defense horizontally. Milroe's ball placement was not good enough, and his release speed wasn't good enough to really run those. I think with Simpson, who has better strengths in those areas, they're going to run those. And so I don't know if Simpson necessarily has to be the world's best quarterback. I think the biggest change is they're going to run a very different scheme. They're going to run more of Grubb's scheme, more DeBoer scheme. It's going to be more RPO based. They're going to be more wide receiver screens to get the ball in space to the receivers, and what is probably still an underrated receiving core because they're extremely talented. And so even if Simpson isn't going to wow people throwing downfield, even if he doesn't have great pocket presence, they could run that offense. And the thing is, and we talk about this a lot, and Florida State's going to do the same thing, and maybe you can talk about Malzahn and that offense in a second, Daniel. When you run the RPO, the advantage of the RPO in modern offense is not so much about its ability to make splash plays like it was 7-8 years ago. Now, defenses have turned to more zone. They play a little much more bend but don't break. They catch it. They disguise coverage to make those reads harder. They muddy it with hybrid safety players near the line of scrimmage. They attack the mesh and the zone read, yada, yada. But if you just run the RPO, it forces the safeties to play back and to play zone. It forces the defense not to key run pass. And what that does is it lets you play complementary power football around it. You basically just want to make sure the defense knows the RPO is a possibility so that they can't play classic run pass keyed safety defense. They have to play modern hybrid zone defense, which gives you some advantages in that the linebackers and safeties are on their heels. You should be able to run the ball with power a lot more successfully. That's why all the power run teams the last couple of years have been like Notre Dame making the national title, why they've been successful. Georgia the last few years when they won national titles, that's why they were successful in my opinion. And it also means from a passing perspective, if you're forcing those guys into zones and hybrid players, maybe you get some advantages, things like the wide receiver screen game, because if they're in zone, it's a little easier to get numbers for that kind of easy play. I think that's, from a scheme perspective, going to be what gives Alabama an advantage. And it's going to be, I think, less about the quarterback change from who Simpson is versus Milroe is, more about some schematic advantages they could bring to the table, because they could never get a clear scheme, in my opinion, with Milroe the last 2 years. They just couldn't figure out how to use him. They're going to know how to use Simpson, whether or not he's better or not. And that's going to, I think, make Alabama in some ways more effective.
On the other side of the ball, Castellanos, if Alabama was playing Boston College last year, team that beat Florida State, with Castellanos in that system, I think this Vegas spread would be astronomical, because in that system, he wasn't very effective, got benched, stopped playing for some reason, and it just wasn't really suited his skills. I think that the opposite is true here, and it's interesting how scheme fit matters so much. He's a guy that really didn't scare you last year in that system. He's a guy that is very scary with a Gus Malzahn scheme that can dedicate just rep upon rep on really setup plays and just grinding you to death at 3 and 4 yards a clip where they don't get off the field. You're not forcing 3 and outs, and it's just frustrating. And then boom, they hit you over the top. So it doesn't rely on him so much being a guy that's anticipating leading receivers, playing a pro style quarterback that can pick you apart. It's none of that. It's a little bit backyard in the most tactical way possible that I do think is going to give this Alabama defense a little bit of fits. I think Florida State's going to score more points than Alabama is comfortable with. It's not the same situation, like you pointed out, Oklahoma game last year a little bit, Vanderbilt game, especially in that Oklahoma game. Alabama fans felt like, I've seen them talk about it on Twitter a lot, they felt like that Oklahoma offense and that, Jackson Arnold just ran all over them and just put up all kinds of numbers when really they only scored 10 points. But they kept the ball all day. And I think there might be some of that at play here, though Gus likes that explosive sort of scoring opportunity, and they're going to have to be explosive against this Alabama defense. I think Florida State's going to score more just because of all those factors. But on the flip side, Alabama facing a 3-3-5 defense, it's interesting because that is tailor-made for a good running program to just grind you up on the ground. The last prominent 3-3-5 Alabama saw was Cincinnati in the playoffs, and I think they had a running back go for like 200 yards. Not a big day for Bryce Young. There's a lot of mixed coverages, a lot of drop 8 in there that can confuse a young quarterback or can make it feel like nobody's open. But I think this is going to lead to Ty Simpson running a lot more than people expect. I do think it's going to give them a little bit of confusing looks in that sense, but I also think that Alabama is just going to be able to score at will. If Jam Miller was in this game, it would be feast situation. I think with Richard Young coming in, there's a little bit of backup situation that's going to be less effective, but dude can still scoot. I actually think the second running back in terms of effectiveness is going to be Washington, who might be technically down on the depth chart, but he's more of a gadget guy, more of a pass game sort of build in this system. He's going to be really effective. Josh, let's talk a little bit about defenses. You have had a lot of opinions on Gus in the past, the offenses he's fielded. Do you feel like there's an opportunity here based on how Alabama plays defense and what's given them recent struggles for Castellanos to really eat? Or is it a situation where modern defenses have figured out what Gus likes to run a little bit in general and then maybe specifically for this Alabama defense?
Let me ask you a question first, Daniel. So, Castellanos, right? The reputation, he's a really good athlete. He is, and he can run the ball, which he can. But let me just ask you up front. He started or played significant minutes in 8 games last year. How many games do you think he had 75 yards rushing?
Half of them.
The answer is 0.
Interesting.
How many games did he have 60 yards rushing?
I don't know. I feel like we're going to be here a while.
1 game. It was the Florida State game. And the point I'm making is, between these two fan bases, including Florida State fans, I think there's a temptation to remember that Florida State game, September 2nd, really opening, first real week of college football. Everybody has an impression of who he was because a lot of people watched that game in an upset over Florida State. But the reality is he wasn't that effective as a runner the remainder of the season. 5 yards per carry versus Florida State. He never averaged 3 yards a carry again the rest of the year. I mean, he had 1 carry versus Duquesne, but toss that. I think, first off, you've got to be a little more hesitant. Even knowing he's a great athlete, even knowing their scheme wasn't really built to utilize him, he's a little more unproven, I think, than people are giving credit for. The second part of this, I will say, is a problem I have with people equating Gus Malzahn's RPO zone read scheme with schemes that are more veer-based. So last year, Alabama ran a very different scheme than what they'd done in the past. Womack came in from South Alabama, installed a more modern zone-based defense. It is a more attacking scheme, heavily blitz-based, a lot more NFL style based on the current trends. Not all that dissimilar in many ways to what Ken Minner ran at Michigan, though what Alabama ran last year was admittedly simplistic because it was first year of the install and they were starting at times multiple true freshmen in the secondary, probably. But Oklahoma and Vanderbilt in particular, they run the veer. Now, the veer is a modern variation of option offense. The veer features a lot of down blocking, meaning the linemen are all kind of pulling one gap, trying to get to an outside shoulder. The thing that differentiates the veer from zone read, well, there's a lot of them. One, zone read, heavily zone blocking based, meaning you block zones. But the zone read is you leave a guy unblocked, and then generally at some point there's a conflict point, be it a jet sweep, be it the zone read itself with the mesh, where I'm going to hand off inside or I'm going to go out, or I'm going to jet laterally or I'm going to go up the middle. And it's about threatening space at the mesh point with the handoff. And so you're making the defense in a spread style defend the entire field while you're keying on a given defender usually who's often unblocked in the defense or second level defender like a linebacker. And even in the RPO concepts, you're making the linebacker say, hey, do I step forward on the run to defend an edge run or a run off guard? Or if he crashes, am I throwing off the top, right? Make them defend space with reads. The veer in traditional option offense attacks a strong side usually, but the play side part of the field almost entirely. Meaning when you run the veer, the running back runs with the quarterback, and it's a matter of do you hand to cut off, like are you handing the ball to cut up field? Are you pitching to go wide? You're stretching the play and attacking with power to a concentrated part of the field. Now, the zone scheme that Alabama runs, I think, is poorly suited for that in a lot of ways because unlike Saban's scheme, which was a two-gap defense, heavily man-based in a lot of ways, but it's really also not man. It's more cover seven, pattern match stuff in the back end. But they were about trying to hold blocks. One defensive lineman eating two blockers, leave the linebackers free to clean up, but very much focused on being gap sound, very much focused on being assignment-driven down to being a man defense. That helps a little bit at times with the option because it's about making sure you have a hat on a hat and you all maintain your assignments. Certainly helps to eat up blockers because the way you defend the option or a veer is to force it to the sideline. You just keep stringing that thing out until it runs out of room, and then it goes for no gain. Very hard to keep the veer from extending drives. That's a big thing from the Vanderbilt game that I've argued with Alabama fans about. They didn't have a drive over 60 yards. Vanderbilt didn't after the second drive of the game. Alabama just gave them a lot of short fields. But you always end up frustrated. You watch teams play Army. I mean, a few years ago, Oklahoma played Army, almost lost. Notre Dame has had their struggles with Navy. Those teams get tons of first downs because it's very hard to stop the option from doing that. The trick is they're not explosive. They don't score quickly ever. They've got to get 6 first downs, 7 first downs, 8 first downs in a row to get points. And the problem is, if you stop them 1 out of 4 times, they almost always punt. It's not true of a typical offense. And so the point of all that is there's a lot of differences really between the veer and Malzahn's offense. I think there's this false equivalency being put forward that Alabama struggled with running quarterbacks. The reality is I think they struggled with the veer because they were a young defense. They didn't understand their assignments in a new system early on. Later on, they're almost, not quite a 3-3-5. They're more of a hybrid, but they're a step away. They were a little light. They struggled with Oklahoma's power at times in that game and kind of got worn down probably because their offense couldn't move the ball. The zone read attack, I think they're much better suited for that because they're focused on penetration, not assignments. The way you fight the zone read is attack the mesh. You don't let the quarterback read space. You just speed up the decision. You attack him at the mesh point, force a quick RPO throw, force a handoff and a bad read. If you force the RPO throw, and we've seen this with Auburn a lot last year with Thorne, you can throw a ton of interceptions if you're overly reliant on the RPO. They kind of had some issues with that with Jefferson at UCF. They had bad reads from times, a lot of negative plays. Even if they aren't INTs, there are a lot of sacks that come out of that. They're designed to do that. Confuse the looks defensively, make it hard to make a read, and not know you're going to throw an RPO right to some sort of coverage twist. Make it hard to mesh because you're getting attacked at the mesh point. I think Alabama's better suited for Florida State in the way they want to defensively attack. Sort of a long diatribe because I like talking ball sometimes, and this to me was sort of a scheme, I think, misunderstanding, by the way, even at the media level. And Daniel, I don't want to go forever on this, so I'm going to go ahead and give sort of my pick on it. Like, I think this game could get pretty lopsided because of what I see as a scheme issue. I think this is like 37-10 Alabama over Florida State. I just think people are underestimating the fact that this is not Nick Saban. This is not a man coverage pattern match defense anymore. Yes, Malzahn gave Alabama fits because of the type of defense Alabama ran. All that man coverage stuff meant their eyes weren't in the backfield. They were more susceptible to the RPO. Holding two blockers works great versus the veer where you're stringing it out. Doesn't work great on the mesh in the zone read or the RPO because it gives the quarterbacks not getting harassed. He can take time on his reads. He can leave a guy unblocked. He can read the RPO cleanly. It's a very different scheme, and I think the differences in scheme, the fact that I don't know how much. I mean, nobody trusts Castellanos as a passer, but I don't trust him as a runner. And defensively and offensively, there's so much turnover. Even if Florida State's going to be a good defense, it's so overhauled. I just think Alabama's the more experienced, more talented team. And I almost think coming out of this game, again, like 37-10, people may be overestimating Alabama and underestimating Florida State because I don't think people appreciate that this is actually just, in my opinion, a bad matchup. And people may come out way too high and way too low about both of these teams if this game goes the way I think it's going to go.
We fairly talked about Ohio State replacing a quarterback and both coordinators and how they might get really good throughout the course of the year, but that's a lot to ask of a team in week one to go face Texas. To me, Alabama is just as good as Texas, if not better, at least in week one. And so I think it's a big ask for Florida State. One of the things about Gus Malzahn's scheme that's really good is that repetition, by the end of the year, everything is really locked in. We saw that a lot at Auburn. It's not so much the case at the very beginning. Even with Cam Newton, like they struggled to beat like South Carolina and Clemson, teams that weren't very good at the beginning of the year. But by the end of the year, they were just a juggernaut. So I also do think that people are sleeping on Alabama a little bit. But I will say in this game, fans of teams that are a little slow out of the gate early like to say that they're sandbagging a little bit, especially sitting on their offensive playbook. We saw that to be the case last year for DeBoer in Georgia. He held a lot back, even like you saw glimpses of it against Wisconsin, but only when they had to. They were running a very vanilla scheme, very vanilla game until they opened it at the end of the second quarter, got a lead, and then shut it down. They held a lot back in preparation for that Georgia game. And so I think if Alabama is making Florida State just a announcement, we're here kind of game, it is that 37-10. I think if they're sandbagging a little bit just to kind of win it and get through Wisconsin, make it to Georgia, it'll be a little bland, it'll be a little vanilla, and you got to wait until that Georgia game to see the full-throated Alabama offense. But I kind of feel like because they have two Power Fours out of conference before the Georgia game, they don't have that luxury of really sitting on it too much. I think this is going to be kind of a statement game for Alabama. I think that you're right. You're in that. I probably give Florida State another, let's say, 16 points. Give them 16 total, and maybe Alabama a little less. I'm going to say 34-16 Alabama. And maybe one of those is a defensive score. I don't know what to expect from Ty Simpson, but I do think given this defense they're going to face and maybe the fact that he sees a lot of drop coverage, I actually got Ty Simpson going for over 80 yards in this game rushing. I think he's going to outrush Castellanos actually in this game and open a lot of people's eyes in terms of his athleticism and how he can scoot in his own right. All right, anything else on this game before we close it out?
The only thing I'll say to the Florida State fans that are angry is, look, it's such an overhaul, and there's so many transfers on this roster that we are guessing, right? I mean, be real from our position, and I think the Florida State fans that I know and have talked to kind of understand it. Florida State was 100th in the country in rush defense last year. They were on the 120s, 130s in offensive statistics. It's hard for me to see why they're going to score many points on what should be an excellent Alabama defense that returned almost everybody. But it may not be. I mean, it may be that Florida State, you bring in Deuce Robinson from USC, Squirrel White from Tennessee. maybe they take a big step forward. Maybe Castellanos in this system works really well. Maybe Malzahn, and in Malzahn certainly has had all offseason to come up with a bag of tricks. Maybe they find ways to exploit this Alabama scheme. I know one of our buddies, Brooks Austin, right, does his college football film room, talked about how Alabama likes to double mug and be in single safety. I think some of that is because the games he broke down being teams that were really run heavy, including Michigan, Oklahoma, Vandy, where they were willing to stay single safety. But maybe he's right, and there's some things that Malzahn's able to exploit for big plays. I mean, we don't know. It's week one. Florida State could be overhauled. Their defense could take the kind of turnaround they did 2 years ago. But I just don't know. And if you're asking me to prognosticate the game, it's hard for me to pick the team that that was really, really terrible statistically, especially in our model last year, over the team that was better than their record and returns a ton of players and has reasons for optimism. So it won't shock me if this ends up skewed the little way around. It'll shock me a little bit if Florida State wins it, honestly, but not if it's more competitive. I just, right now, what's in front of me, feel like it ought to go the other way based on what I've known. And if it doesn't, it may be a sign that Florida State's turned things around. Because historically, I thought Norvell was a very good coach. It just, last year, they were not good. And it wasn't just DJU. I mean, they were terrible defensively, which flew, again, 100th in rush defense. That ain't just a DJU problem. That roster was fundamentally bad and had real problems at all levels. And so it's going to take a pretty significant turnaround for them to be a better team. And, for Florida State's sake, I really hope that's the case.
All right. Little homework for y'all in the comments. Give us rushing yardage that you think for Castellanos and for Ty Simpson, and we'll review that and see if you were right or not. All right, well, thanks so much for watching this long. It's another long one. Got previews coming out all this week, and we have that Alabama preview, Ohio State and Texas team previews that we released a couple of weeks ago for you to check out as well. We're so happy to be back. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.